Hey, what's up, everybody? This is the Unconventional Therapist Guide to Nothing. My name is Dave. I'm joined here with my co host. His name is Greg. What's up,
Yeah.
Greg?
No, I only laugh because not because I think it's funny, but we're talking about how maybe you're feeling a little under the weather, and then as soon as you talk, I'm like, ooh, I can hear it. You know what I
Jeez.
mean? When you can hear it a little bit with people. So
Yeah,
I hope that that's not true.
me
We
too.
were we were just saying there's a huge flu in like I don't know, it was not even I wouldn't even say COVID as much, I guess, but like huge flu,
Yep.
huge RSV. It just seems to be everywhere. Am I missing one? Is there another illness that we're
I mean, the flu is definitely the one I'm hearing the most.
flu is
That's,
kicking, and
yeah.
I hear it's a pretty nasty one too. So
Yeah, I never really heard of the flu not being a nasty one.
it's true. No one really loves the flu,
No.
but I think there's got to be times where it's like not so bad, and then there's the Spanish flu where it's crippling the population. You know what I
The
mean?
Spanish
So
influenza.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
What was that? Right after World War One, as if not enough people didn't die. Anyways,
Well, that's a
so
depressing note to start us off on.
okay, here we go. Well, listen, this is actually the topic we're going to talk about today. I want to say it's both. I hate to say the word entertaining, but there is a show about this, and I'm sure you're very much aware of it. But there's also a show that I'll mention first that I was, before I was having anything to do with this field, I watched a lot of intervention.
Okay, yeah.
Did you?
I've seen a lot of episodes. Yep.
So, I mean, I don't know. I used to like watch like episode after episode after episode, and it was, I don't know if that's like voyeuristic to watch someone struggle, and maybe we're looking for the redemption, or maybe we just like to see the train wreck. That's a quite a human thing too.
Sure.
But I don't know what it is. But this is another example of that. And but before we say exactly, well, it doesn't matter. I'll just say we're talking about hoarding disorder, right?
Yep.
And I think what comes to mind with this for me is it's uncomfortable to realize that our emotions and our beliefs are more powerful at times than the absolute truth. And the best example I guess I can give is when we're watching scary movies, we know that they're actors. We like logically we know that we should not be scared of this because we can watch little clips of them being with their families or, dressed normally or at award shows even. But for some reason, the emotions and the beliefs take hold of the logic and it's overpowering, right?
Right.
So this is the same kind of thing, and obviously it's like very obsessive. It's irrational and it's damaging, but you can't stop. It does have that addiction element to it, doesn't it? Obviously,
Oh, definitely.
yeah.
It's weird because it's like that thing that transitions from addiction to obsession. And those can be, it's like kind of like a fine line back and forth between both of those. But it's definitely a combination of both.
It is, and it's funny because sometimes we don't give the things that don't have a chemical dependency or the change, like, hack your reward system in the same way as like, a drug can do, like heroin or an opiate, like cocaine, whatever. They can, alcohol, obviously, you get physically addicted to them. But these mental addictions can be just as powerful. I mean, they really
Yeah,
can.
for
Or
sure.
or can they? I don't know. What's your Dave, honestly, like before we get into this, like what's your take on that? Is that like is the hoarding addiction as powerful as other addictions? I mean, I don't know if that's a right or a
One
wrong.
100%.
Okay.
I absolutely think it is.
Hmm.
I think it's an interesting disorder because it really, for each person, it can look so different. It can have different rationales, different reasonings, which we'll get into. But there's that emotional tie and
Mhm.
that almost oblivious state that the person can exist in for, but it's almost to protect themselves in a way, or there's just it's so complex.
And it's
And
real too, because even when you're
yeah,
watching those shows, I mean, someone who's struggled with OCD, like myself, like that OCD is like the seventh most debilitating disease that there is. And that's like all of all diseases. And people hear that and they're like, no. And it's like, yeah, kind of. Like this is the kind of thing you see these people and they're like, no, like you family, you can get out of here. You can just leave. Like I'm gonna keep this, stack of paper and the cat poop and, you know, the dead cat or whatever, the cockroaches, whatever it is. Like it's more important than it becomes more important than even your family. So there's some kind of pull there, a real
sure.
pull.
Yeah. So the interesting thing with hoarding disorder is it wasn't officially considered to be its own disorder until it was added into the DSM-5 in 2013. So prior to
Mm.
that, it was just considered to be a symptom of obsessive compulsive disorder or obsessive compulsive personality disorder rather than its own separate thing. I think that's interesting, and I wanted to get your take on that. Why do you think it needed to be added as its own isolated thing, or do you think it needed to be?
So that's a great question, actually. I think it should be its own thing because it's very specific. And OCD is, I guess I like the idea that it's under the spectrum of OCD, just like something would be under this spectrum of dementia. You know what I mean? Or like neurocognitive disorder. I think that like it's closely related with OCD, but the fact that it's connected to stuff makes it slightly different. You know
Right.
what I mean? It's like this weird emotional connection to things.
Yeah. So that looks
And
a little
it,
different.
it looks a little bit different. And I also like to differentiate between the uh, the disorder OCD and the personality disorder, which is something that's like a little bit different too, where it's like someone with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, like that compulsion becomes their whole personality, and they have a little bit less of that. I know that I'm doing this and I know this is irrational, which is one of the frustrating things about OCD. And they also don't have that thing in their brain that says like, no, that's enough. This is okay. Like this is finished. And
Yeah.
not having that is in a very difficult place to be. And that's how things like the collection's never enough,
Right.
right? And it goes beyond their own rational. Is they're not irrational or psychotic people. That's the thing, right? Like there are ways to kind of break in with them. It's just really, really hard. It's almost like think about how when we talked about narcissistic personality disorder, like how hard would it be to break in to the mind of a narcissist? It's like they're so sure that they have it figured out that it's difficult to show them,
Well,
right? There's
again,
so much self-esteem.
it's that idea that the symptoms themselves exist as a protective factor over
Hmm.
whatever it is that's causing them distress or that they're trying to ignore in their lives. So with hoarding, much of it is trying to look away from various things that could have potentially happened, and we'll get into some of the reasons. Uh, but as most people can, imagine, trauma being one of those, of course.
Yeah, I like how you say it protective because it seem that way. Like I've seen the show a lot. Have you?
Yeah, I
So
and the funny thing is, I was going to share this later. I actually have some in-person experience with this, not even through the work that we do, but I've mentioned numerous times on here that do a lot of like go to a lot of antique shops and antique flea markets, and I've become
oh
familiar
no.
with a number of people that sell at those antique flea markets, and it's not that uncommon that a lot of those individuals might have hoarding tendencies.
Right. And it's also like, as you say that, I'm thinking for some people, we're so quick to kind of be like, this is a disorder so much that maybe we forget sometimes that there's use in it too. Like
it,
I
it can be
watched
become a
yeah,
lifestyle.
American like pickers, is that what it's called?
Yeah. Yep.
So they go to people who clearly have a hoarding disorder, but they're like, hey, this person's kind of a genius. They got their stuff, they understand their stuff, but they're also like climbing over their bed. That like they have 6 inches in their bed to sleep in because they have stuff piled up.
So the interesting thing about them and about some of the individuals I'm mentioning is they're different from some of the symptoms and kind of overview that we're going to give here, because we're talking, those are people that might actually part with some of their items
Good
versus
point.
individuals who won't. But even just from my own personal experience,
That's
it's
right.
not an
I
easy
was gonna
thing
say.
for them to maybe part with their stuff. They might struggle with pricing, like overvaluing things that don't have a lot of value, trying to sell things that are damaged, and still trying to keep it as if it was mint condition value. Or it's all about the thrill of, I sold this, I made this money, now I'm going to go buy even more with what I just made. So a
Yeah.
lot of different elements in some of the experiences that I've been able to have in person, but I think it all is kind of included in what we're going to be discussing.
I like the word spectrum, right?
Yeah.
Everything's kind of on a spectrum.
Yep.
Humanity is on a spectrum.
For sure.
So what is hoarding disorder exactly? Let's talk about it a little bit. Like hoarding disorder in this case is a mental health condition. It doesn't always have to be, but in for the purposes of this show, it's a person who feels strong and the need to save a number of items which they think has monetary value, or even if they don't think has monetary value, like the significant items in their life, you know?
Yeah, that emotional connection can be just as strong and valuable to those individuals. I like what you said though when you started the sentence. For this
Mhm.
case, we're going to use it as a disorder, but it doesn't have to be a disorder. Can
Right.
you explain that?
Well, I think that it all depends on just like any other kind of, if we were like, what is a mental health disorder? Like people can be quirky, people can weird, people can have things that are different than us. But if it's getting in the way of their livelihood or their family or their relationships,
Right.
then it's something you want to kind of take a look at,
So
right?
that's kind of the thing that we always like to say. I think everybody can have a touch of depression. As
Sure.
we've said 1,000 times, everybody has a little bit of anxiety, but it's when these things start to impact your ability to function in life,
Mhm.
that's when
And
you want to get
thrive,
treatment.
really. I think thrive is a good word, right?
Sure. Yep.
Like, are you able to thrive? Like, or is it clear? Like we're talking about, so we're talking people hold like newspapers and magazines and house and clothes and household goods, all this stuff. But then there's also times where there's like a number of dead animals,
And
and
that's typically like a by from my understanding, and maybe you've
yeah,
seen differently, but that's typically a byproduct to the condition, right?
sure, yeah. It's not like they're like I collect dead cats,
And sometimes they don't even know. Like I'm
right?
sure you've seen 1,000 episodes where
Yeah.
they're pulling off stuff off the
Mhm.
kitchen floor, and then there's unfortunately a dead pet under all that stuff that they hadn't seen in
Yeah, and the
periods, right?
cockroaches always, and a lot of that's obviously dramatized. Is not always going to be that bad, but it can
Yeah.
be. It can
There's
be for
there's
sure.
this meme that goes around, or like a reel, and on Instagram. It's from Hoarders, the show Hoarders, and it's this woman who is just she's like doing a crib tour almost of her house, and meanwhile she's just climbing over like all these heaps of trash, and it's so funny because it's exactly what you would envision. It's like that stereotype of they're living in these horrible overloaded conditions, and yet they have a smile on their face and they're like, oh, watch your step there. Meanwhile it's like a giant stack of
Yeah, yeah.
trash, right?
Do you think there's like an element of self-deceit for sure? Like,
100%.
right,
Yeah.
where they're like kind of people, their families telling them, and they just have to keep telling themselves this lie, and then they become isolated, and then they don't have to lie about it anymore, and it becomes a normal thing where it's just like, oh, this isn't strange anymore. This is
Yeah.
just my life. And this can lead to dangerous, dangerous clutter like you're talking about. Obviously interfere with your quality of life, your family. It can cause, shame. Like imagine if your mom is one of these people, is a hoarder, and she's got things piled up, and you've got kids in the house, and now those kids are ashamed or afraid to bring their kids around, or not their kids, but their friends, because it smells and it's unsafe and it's unhealthy and it's embarrassing, you know?
Yeah. And it doesn't help that there is a stigma around hoarding.
Mm.
And that's something that I think is important to understand how that affects people. When there's a stigma around something, it's really hard for them to acknowledge when it exists in them, right?
Yeah.
So, like substance abuse, hoarding is definitely something I think has a stigma. We talked about borderline personality disorder and the stigma around that. When there gets to be this negative stigma or these stereotypes that get thrown around all the time, and everyone has just this one understanding of it, I think it makes people feel like, I don't want to be that
Uh-huh.
stereotype. And then they do that self-deceit thing that we were talking about, or they just hide.
Yeah, or they do that CBT thing we talk about where they tell themselves a story that it makes it okay to do what they're doing.
Yeah.
I guess that's self-deceit too, right?
Right.
In a nutshell. Have you ever seen, Dave, we kind of come from the same generation, but I think that maybe this was before our time, but my father and I used to watch a show called Sanford and Son.
I never watched that. I know of it, but
Oh,
I
man,
never
it's
watched
actually
it.
like really good. And he worked at, like, they lived and worked at a junkyard and just reminded me of this a lot. It was a really funny show, though. Anyways, Dave, how does something like this kind of develop?
Well, the thing with hoarding is I think that it can be very individualistic. So for some people, it can progress over years. And I think this is why we might see so many, at least what we see on media, and a lot of people, when they actually acknowledge that there's an issue or their family acknowledges, they're usually an older individual, maybe I'm not saying this is super old, but like in their 50s, 60s,
Mm.
to the point where it's, maybe they're so isolated and they're starting to have health issues, things like that. And people can't even offer them support around that. So I think that it can kind of sneak up on the people around that person because of the isolation, like the isolated nature of the disorder, right?
Yeah.
Or people avoid going to like so and so's house because it's, oh, it's so cluttered all the time or it's so dirty. They avoid going. And then when, they go back again years later, suddenly it's like, whoa, what just happened here?
Yeah. And the person doesn't even really see it, of course, because it's been gradual. It's almost like that idea of like you are, if you're in a bathtub, like you can boil yourself to death if the heat is incremental enough. It's just
Yeah.
this what can happen, you know?
Or if it's like, Greg, if I told you one of your kids looked fat, you'd be like, well, I wouldn't know. I see them every day. So
Yeah, 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 yeah,
I'm
yeah.
just kidding. All of Greg's kids.
They're all fit.
They're all so fit and buff. So some of the things that might start to develop is this difficulty of letting things go. This could be throwing away, selling, recycling, giving away. The clutter. These are all the like early warning signs. The clutter may make it difficult for the person to easily move throughout the home. The pile of items keep tipping over. So, like you mentioned, the newspapers, magazines, things like that. Uh, they might start sleeping with the items in their bed or on their bed, or they might have difficulty organizing, categorizing, making decisions around the stuff, spending time moving things from pile to pile without letting them go. They might have like a maybe pile, and that maybe turns to almost there, and then
Yeah.
it just never happens. Uh, they might have like excessive shopping or collecting sprees and things like that. And the biggest thing is there's no realization of the seriousness of the problem. Now, I do think it's important to recognize that not everybody who has some of these symptoms or these early warning signs is going to progress to being a serious hoarder. There's
No.
plenty of people who might exhibit some of these behaviors and not have a hoarding issue in their life ever.
Yeah, and I think like it's almost when we say not realizing the seriousness of the problem, it's almost as if, as far as we know, because I really do believe that. And again, I don't want to like brag, but I have, dealt with OCD a lot when I was, young, and still, of course, it's always like lingers, but you can really do a good job of knowing, like thinking a certain way or doing a certain thing and knowing it's irrational, but kind of like making a case for it not being,
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's hard. It's a hard thing. So I'll talk a little bit about like the difference between hoarding and collecting because I actually, you know, we talked about in the past how like we've had bouts with anxiety and stuff like that. And way back when I first got out of the Navy, I struggled with anxiety a little bit. And collecting isn't something that I did to calm me, but watching American Pickers was for whatever reason mindfulness to me before I even knew what it was. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It took me right out of it. And I don't know why. I don't know if it was just so a show about absolutely nothing. You could kind of walk away and jump back in and didn't really matter. It was just something about it that really kind of calmed me.
And there's also this idea that there's going to be a diamond in the rough,
Yes. Hope.
right?
Hope.
So
What's wrong with
one of
that?
the big things that happened over the pandemic was the thrift stores started to go like boom, right? As soon
Mm.
as stores started to open back up, for whatever reason, thrift stores caught on, and people started to go in hopes that they were going to find this expensive item for like $5, right? And then
Mhm.
they could resell it. And that has ultimately now kind of ruined thrift stores because they no longer, now they know they have value to some of their items and they're upping the prices, but also everything's pretty much picked over. But there's something about that idea that like I'm going to go somewhere that's not supposed to have something, right? And I'm going to find it and it's going to have all this value and now I win, right?
It sounds almost, Dave, if I can be, you know, frank, candid with you,
Sure.
sounds a little bit like you're speaking from personal experience. There's a little bit of passion in your voice when you're talking about that.
Well, I definitely was doing the thrift store thing. I was doing the reselling thing.
Diamond in the rough, right?
For 100%. And also, my parents have also acknowledged this. Even as like a young child, I've always been like a completist. So if
Mm.
there was, let's say McDonald's had a Happy Meal and there was six toys, I needed to have all six.
All Mario 3. You get the Goomba and everything.
I'm trying to think of what would it was more like Ninja Turtle stuff usually back then. I'm trying to
The
think of what other.
Halloween chicken nuggets.
Yes, yeah, things like that for
That's a
sure.
good one.
And
Yeah,
I'm still like that. If I get something, I feel the need to get a set. I
I
have to
like
get a
that.
set. It kind of bothers me if I don't.
Okay, so you don't have obsessive compulsive personality disorder if you can feel complete when you get the set, that when you feel like, okay, that's good. You
Yeah,
know
I
what I
kind
mean?
of stopped caring about it as much.
That's good.
Yeah,
That's good.
yeah,
That's what we're talking about here. So yeah, that's great. My real quick though, my son is you. I think maybe you guys should have a little excursion because he's been into the thrifting too, and
yeah.
he just showed up the other day with like an old Paw Sox jacket, and I'm like, where'd you get that? He's like, oh, I got it at a thrift shop. I'm like, how much was that? And he's like, $120. I was like, that's you're doing it wrong, right?
That's the problem now. They know they have
Yeah.
valuable stuff. I used to get like, and this is a tangent. I used to get NBA
Okay.
basketball jerseys and from like the 90s, and
Yeah.
I would get them for super cheap in the thrift store. And now they know that you can sell those on eBay for quadruple the price that I bought it for. A lot of them I kept because I actually like those, but still, they're like $100 at the thrift store. It's like this is not thrift. This is
Yeah, this is the wrong idea.
yes,
This is market value.
right,
That's not what we're going for here.
exactly, yeah,
So this is cool that we're talking about this because collecting, what we're talking about here, normally it involves like certain types of things. Like you're looking for your comic books. You're looking for your, I don't think people are doing stamps too much anymore. Those, what are they, those things? Pops, is that what they're called?
the Funko
Records.
Pops.
Yeah, like I've seen, stereo equipment, whatever. You
Yeah.
have this like carefully chosen item and
Do
they're
you collect any of those
organized
things?
and I collect, I do a little bit with like art. I do. And I do like to collect records,
Okay.
which
I
I
got
think,
into the records for a little bit.
yeah, that's a pretty fun thing. Books too.
Yeah,
I'm very much into
unfortunately, I'm on that one as
Yeah,
well.
I love collecting books, and I'll like even though I know I'll never read them all, something about having them the opportunity and them in the house that make it's like comforting to me. I like that a lot. But hoarding is a little bit different. So hoarding involves, you know, things that there's no, little or no monetary value. We'll start with that. So like when you're
Yeah,
collecting, it's like the idea is, all right, I'm collecting this and I understand like there are other people, it's almost like other people agree that there's something important about this thing that I'm collecting,
right.
right? It's not like a bunch of broken pieces of paper and wet envelopes and broken toys that is causing this horrific family disruption and they're holding on to it so tightly. Now that's hoarding. Collecting is different. But I'm sure
Hoarding,
there's a lot of
hoarding could
overlap there.
hoarding could also look like, I collect records, and the person literally means I collect all records that
That's
I
right.
see, right?
That's right.
Versus I don't know what you collect. I'm gonna guess classic rock.
Oh
I
yeah.
I collect
Hip hop too.
horror movie theme scores,
Oh,
so
that's
very very
awesome. Yeah.
specific. Uh, so yeah, it's like
Old
a
comedy
hoarder might
album.
be everything. What's that?
Old comedy albums I have. I like stuff like that too.
I guarantee you got the Bill Cosby ones.
I do, and I feel I'm conflicted by it now. That my sister and I used, and it brings up that awesome question that we talk about in school. Is like, what do I do with that? Can I still appreciate the art because it's classic, or do I have to dispose of it because of his actions? That's a tidbit podcast. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a shorty.
Write that down.
Okay, I don't have paper, but
Oh,
right now,
all
but
right, we
you,
got to remember this. Someone,
yeah,
someone remind us. The
please,
other
yeah.
thing with hoarding is condition won't matter, right? So you might acquire it in a way that is broken, just dismantled, whatever, just not good condition, and that won't matter. And you might see a better version of it, and instead of like trading it out for that or replacing it, you will just collect the other item as well, and now
Yeah,
you have two of that item that you probably
yeah.
don't need two of. And yeah, so the condition really doesn't matter, and the letting go of the damaged products does not matter.
I
I
get,
just wanted to mention this because
sure.
there's this one guy that I know, and he's actually a real or he really was a well-known flea market guy in New York City. High
Okay.
end items, was selling all this stuff, sold to some pretty big names, and now he's still in the game. He is like so many what do you call them, storage lockers filled with all of the items that he's supposedly selling at some point. But he has a school. He bought a school, and it is to the point where it's dangerous to let people go in there. It's a liability for him to let people go in there because of the condition of the school with all the stuff in it. And the parking lot is full of all of his items, cars, everything. And I have witnessed him have things on his tables at the markets that are broken, that are just items that should just be discarded. Like it's this item's
Yeah.
done. Like it's just he throws it in a bin, not even covers, puts it in his van, and then he goes to the next show.
So
And
that brings up an incredible point, Dave. Like, I'm glad you brought that up. That was a smart thing to bring up because that highlights this idea that inside some of these disorders lies genius. And that goes for music, especially
sure,
poetry, writing. I mean, come on. Like, I mean, music. I like Kurt Cobain was disturbed, right? Chris Cornell is disturbed. The Chester Betting, like all these people who have like serious mental health disorders were distorted. I know there's like a lot of like addiction in there,
sure.
but even just we see with like bipolar disorder and like Kanye. I mean, and I know Kanye is what he is,
Say
but
that
like,
again.
come
Say it
on,
again.
Kanye.
Yay. I like the emphasis on the yay.
Yeah, I mean, it would be hard to deny that there isn't some level of like,
He
even though
sees
he,
music as colors. I mean, yeah, there's definitely something there with him. But
yes,
unfortunately, because of his disorders, he can't rein himself in at times.
but the question would be like, had it not been for the disorder, would you have ever heard his name?
Yeah. Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
I mean, so
You
it's like
know,
a
I was funny you bring that up, and you mentioned writers too, and I actually was somewhere today, and No Reservations was on TV with Anthony Bourdain,
yes.
and he was he's a writer, but a fantastic traveler and documenter, and he did so many cool things, but obviously somewhere also tormented with depression
Yeah.
or who knows what else. I'm not too familiar with kind of what got him to the point where he took his own life. But again, another one that,
Hemingway.
would you ever know these individuals if it weren't for their pain and suffering?
We wouldn't know Viktor Frankl,
That's true.
you know? So it's
Yeah.
like, boy, I don't know. So let's talk a little bit about like who it affects. I mean, it could begin in adolescence like it did for you and gradually worsen with age, which seems to
I
be
am not a hoarder.
happening. So,
And I'm not just saying that
but
because of the stigma. I literally am not.
okay. So, but it's more likely to affect people over 60 and people with other mental health conditions, like anxiety, depression, obviously OCD.
Yeah.
And how common is it? I'm gonna say, well, it's between 2 and 6% of people in the people of the United States have hoarding disorder. That's kind of common.
2 to 6
Like,
percent. It's funny. I thought the number was low, and I was like, but the amount of people I've actually
that's a lot of
experienced,
people. Yeah.
yeah, feels like it should. I thought the number was actually going to be a little bit higher, but
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah,
yeah.
but if
When
you
you
think
say it,
math, I mean, with
I don't want to think about
three hundred
math.
fifty million people in the United States, 6% of that has got to be something
It's like
scary.
35, I think, or
Like
something.
35 million?
Oh, I just 35.
Yeah. 35 people. It's not
Yes,
bad.
actually, I think we can end here.
Yeah. All right,
I
why don't we like
Go
talk a little
ahead.
bit about like symptoms and stuff?
Sure.
All right.
Which I mean,
So
we kind of already discussed, but because a lot of the symptoms that lead up to it are also very heavily present when the person is full fledged into hoarding.
that's true. Yeah. So well, just to kind of like recap a little bit though. So we're talking about, the inability to get rid of things. And not just the inability, but the extreme stress when attempting to throw things out. And anxiety about needing other things in the future, uncertainty about where to put things, distrust of people touching their possessions. You see that a lot in the show, right?
Yeah.
Living in unusable spaces due to their disorder. And obviously, you're going to have to start withdrawing from friends and family because other people aren't going to understand you. And it's like you're choosing this thing over the very basic human need of social interaction, and it's isolating you. And anytime something's isolating you, it's the wrong thing.
Right. No, and kind of back to the point that I made earlier that people can exhibit some of these symptoms without having a hoarding disorder. But something I read recently is one of the early behaviors of someone who's experiencing dementia or Alzheimer's is hoarding behavior.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting, but I've also I think I've kind of witnessed it in a way. Just items that don't really have use suddenly seem, have this importance. And another thing that I've witnessed is I had an individual, a teenager that I was working with when he lived at a group home. And I started to suddenly find a bunch of trash in his room, like gum wrappers and stuff like that. And he was actually a pretty like neat and clean individual, at least appearance wise. And then I went into his room and I was trying to encourage him to throw the items away. And if you watched the distress on his face, it was I couldn't understand it. I couldn't wrap my head around it. And then it kind of dawned on me like, oh, there's something going on here. Like he's like, I might need that. And I was like, you might need this gum wrapper. I'm not following.
You're
But I
like,
could
probably not,
but there was but
unless you have gum in
to
your mouth right now.
and watching how it went from calm to suddenly highly upset and dysregulated was shocking because it was someone that I hadn't thought of in the realm of hoarding at all. And I mean, to be honest, it never progressed to anything noteworthy, but it was
Yeah.
definitely something that was present at a certain time. And I don't know if it was like stress related or, there might have been who knows what other reasons for it, but it was just an interesting thing.
That is interesting. And as far as like what causes it, like we don't really know at the exact cause at all, just like with a lot of things. So there's, information about processing deficits associated with hoarding that like there's difficulty and deficits in planning, obviously, problem solving, visual spatial learning and memory, sustained attention, working memory, and organization. So there's some underlying sort of components of personality that exist with people with hoarding disorder, but
Mm.
that just like is that correlation or causation? Who really knows? So people, we
Yeah.
just don't really know. But there's also risk factors that include like having a relative. So maybe there's some kind of genetic component to this, or I don't know, maybe you're just socialized into it.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
I actually personally believe that there's some kind of like exposure
Yeah.
that can create that tendency in you. If you witness, and I think it could go either way. And here, so that individual I was talking about that does all the flea markets and was kind of a big shot, some of his children had a really tough time with his disorder, and they went the complete opposite route and they don't collect anything. They actually don't like antiques or anything because of the way it impacted their own childhood, because it felt to them, I would assume, that their father prioritized items
Yeah.
over them. And he had some pretty specific examples of times he knew that it took over. Like he was telling me about this time he took his grandson and his son to the aquarium. They were doing like a family trip to the aquarium and they stopped in this gift shop. And suddenly he spotted this deal at the gift shop. And it was like some percentage off these books. And they were actually like older books. And it caught his like, that flea market eye that he has.
Like, mm,
And he wiped all the shelves and started to make them help him carry all the books out of the store.
yeah.
And they were so pissed.
And he
Well,
couldn't see like how irrational it was in the
in
moment.
retrospect, he sees it now, but in the moment, it was like he calls it a bug,
Yeah.
and he has an interesting origin, which uh, I just think talking about this a little bit might help kind of explain how things can lead to this. So he was actually caught in the middle of a messy divorce, and his mom, he was literally being tugged by both sides, but neither side truly cared. It was
Yeah.
more of a possession thing. He was a possession and they were winning. Whoever would get him would win. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So at some point, I think he connected with items more than people because he felt safer with items, like they wouldn't hurt him.
Wow.
So I think that was pretty impactful. And there's a lot more to his story. But I thought when he told me that story, and then I see the way that he currently is with things, it's like, wow, yeah, you start to latch on to things that or you think won't hurt you, but look at how they do in the long run. When you don't get a handle on the disorder itself, it overtakes your life. It
That's it right
separates you from
there.
your children in
That's the
your
thing right there.
family.
Like that's when it becomes almost personality disorder-esque and leaning more towards like the obsessive compulsive personality disorder because when you have a personality disorder, whether like say it's like paranoid personality or like borderline or antisocial, it's like this one component of your personality blots out all the rest of the components of your personality, which should make you a little bit more well-rounded, and you can't see the other important parts of
Yeah.
yourself. And it's like it's almost like how Jung wants you to balance out all your archetypes, and instead of just being like one specific thing, it's like you need to be a lot of different things. So you can't just have like this seeing something like not being able to pass up a deal like that or something like that. That's like that thing's taking up your whole personality. You don't even see that you've got like your kids ruining their
Yeah.
day and they're carrying a bunch of stuff
Right.
out. And
Right.
that is a risk factor, right? When people who are like that impulsive buying habits and not being able like coupon people, if there's anything wrong with that these days, flyers. Obviously, like there's substance use disorder and Prader-Willi syndrome, but Prader-Willi syndrome is something that's a we're not even talking about that here. That's a significant,
It's food related.
yeah, that's like a significant deficit too. I mean,
Yeah.
where like I don't even know
They're
what
missing a sensation. That's like a biological thing
it's
because they're
biological. It's also like very developmental where
sure.
you wouldn't it's almost like autism in a sense, but it's more like an intellectual deficit where so I we had this um person with Prader-Willi in the emergency room not too long ago, and thank God that we could bring their mother back who could calm this person because they were a giant human being. Because part of it's like you don't get that sensation to stop eating, which is
Yeah. You never
how
feel
this is
full.
related in a sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that I don't feel is that part of your brain with obsessive compulsive personality disorder or even hoarding where it's like it never feels complete. So and this is more in a biological sense where you never feel complete, but in terms of, sustenance. So this is a big human being
Yeah.
who has like essentially the mind of a 10-year-old who's pissed and doesn't
Yeah.
understand why you're not giving him another peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? And so it becomes some like a dangerous thing. Anyways,
So I worked with an individual. He's probably like 16, also in the group home, and he had Prader-Willi. His intellectual disability was not as significant,
okay.
but his drive for the food was top notch.
Like
And
addiction level, right?
I watched. We had to put a lock on the fridge. We did get it. I had to get it approved from the Human Rights Committee and all that stuff, DCYF. And yeah, I watched him like sneak in when the fridge was unlocked, sneak in and down a pound of American cheese. And that was just one example of frozen waffles. Any
Yeah.
opportunity that food was available was just in it causes because you start to get limited, you start to look for opportunities. So it creates this very opportunistic personality, I think.
And that sounds very addiction-esque, where
It
you have
does
become very
100%. Yep.
addictive. Yeah, that's something. So Dave, like why things,
So
items?
I think I kind of answered this already when I was
Yeah.
talking about that individual. But again, I think that inanimate items don't speak, they don't
Mhm.
judge, they don't criticize. They're things that you can grow attachment to that, like I said, they won't hurt you. And a lot of times, like I think that a lot of people who are experiencing hoarding tendencies or hoarding behavior have been hurt in some way. I think there's either been a trauma or some sort of broken relationship. I think, watching that show Hoarders, like I feel like a number of those individuals either like lost a parent and they just couldn't get over it, or they were widowed.
Mhm.
A lot of them were single, like people living single in
So,
their
some maybe
adult
some
home.
maybe that like is like something or someone was keeping them in check, or maybe this is like an avoidance or filling something for them, you know?
Yeah. And another thing, yeah, this pushes people away. So when you literally box yourself in and you make your space so that others can't enter, you push
Mm,
people away, right?
yeah,
So I think that this is definitely a behavior that's an avoidance behavior
absolutely.
to help you isolate. And when people ask you to reduce the items, it presents with a lot of distress because if I were to reduce these items, I'm now going to be vulnerable. Other people can enter my space physically and, metaphorically.
You know that there's like a lot of layers to this, isn't there? It
Yeah,
seems like.
it
So that's kind
does.
of interesting. And here's the thing about diagnosing or tr getting treatment. It's, when you have, we've talked about this before with bipolar, when someone is manic, they're not coming to seek treatment. When someone's psychotic, they're not coming to seek treatment, right? So when you have hoarding disorder, you're not really going to be going to seek treatment because you're not looking to get help or you don't feel like you need help. So it's like
Yeah.
your family members, your friends reach out to someone and then they have to have this,
This
I
is
don't know,
like the
intervention.
intervention
Yeah,
that you were talking about.
that's exactly what it has to be because without that, and then there's a difficulty of like revealing to the person that what you're doing is damaging yourself. It's damaging your ability to thrive, like we talked about. Like it's like creating like a failure to thrive situation. It's d damaging your relationship. It's m making you alone, and it's your quality of life is going down the tubes. And maybe these animals or these things that you probably love, like you have to see that you're hurting things more than helping things. It's like it's almost like you have to show them it's like you have to look at their own darkness, like their
Yeah.
shadow, which is a scary, hard thing to do. And I don't know. I mean, obviously, you treat something like this with CBT. Beyond that, there's, like any
I think
SSRI
exposure
or
would be
exposure
something.
for sure. Yeah, that's under the umbrella of CBT too. Like exposure for sure. Of course, you're gonna have to like exposure to response prevention, just like you would for OCD. That's why there's a lot of tie-ins there. It's like, all right, so watch this thing. We're gonna start slow, like we would with an hierarchy for exposure. We're gonna start slow. We're gonna take these envelopes, maybe these dead cats, maybe these
Jeez.
cockroaches. Let's get them out of the house. And you're gonna sit with that and you're gonna watch it happen. You're gonna expose yourself to not to just the act itself or the thing going away, but the feeling. And then when you realize that you're okay after a little while and you don't have to have this like intense response, then we move to the next step, right? It's like slowly but surely seeing your life change for the better, hopefully,
And then the other version of that is somebody just comes in and takes care of it for you, and you sit there
and freak out.
completely distressed,
Yeah.
and you have to
That
deal
would
with
be
it.
flooding, right?
Flooding.
That's flooding, yeah. So
And sometimes it gets to that point where you lose the ability to even have choice, right? It might,
yeah,
your house could get condemned.
that's absolutely true too. That's that's true too. And then
So I
that person
think
probably ends
I
up in a real bad spot.
yeah, I think the treatment for this is about avoiding getting to that space where you no longer have choice.
Yeah. So
So
and when they talk about prevention, it's like, all right, prevention has to do just like with anybody else. It's like, how is your life set up? It's almost like luck. Like prevention's fine if you got this super supportive family, but if you're a widow and you don't really have any close family and or a widower and you don't really have anyone around that's always checking on you, prevention's tough,
yeah,
right? You got to find some meaning in life, and sometimes this is what it is.
yeah,
And
that's the problem. I think is this becomes the person's meaning.
yeah. And they're never going to look on their own for something to help them,
I
right?
think I think it may provide meaning, but it lacks fulfillment
Yeah.
because it just becomes an existence versus like I'm working towards something. So it's kind
That's
of
true.
a dead end in some ways.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, like I've got a lot more notes, but it's kind of like more of the same. I mean, we talk a little bit about like what CBT would do, but it is just about like identifying those thoughts and beliefs relating to getting rid of these items. Like, what's that really going to be like? Have you explored that a little bit and resisting the urge, like you talked about, right?
Yep.
So, getting rid of the stuff and then resisting that urge to get more items, that urge control thing. I mean, maybe removing stuff in your home with a therapist with you or a personal organizer and like a team, almost like a team effort for these things. I don't really like it when in the episodes, especially where someone comes in and they're like, all right, we're getting everything out of here. Even
Yeah.
though before I did this work, I was like, yeah, like get out of the way, lady. Like it's time. You almost feel like that. This is for your own good. But it's like, you don't know what that person's going through. It's kind of harsh.
Yeah. The other part is it feels as though it would make sense to try to replace items with relationships if
Mm,
possible. So if you were working with someone, maybe trying to find some support network, some social outlet for the individual, because I think what you'll find is a lot of these individuals probably lack that. And
yes.
like we talked about with, lacking meaning or, what gives you meaning? Sometimes giving what gives you meaning is being someone for someone else at times, being able to support other people. Being isolated can feel very alone and very debilitating. And I think that's kind of they almost create their own existence, their own world, right? That's where that
Yes.
kind of delusion comes in that like this is okay.
The delusion, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And it's funny, there's like this quote in Oscar Wilde, something or other. I can't remember if it's from Dorian Gray or whatnot, but something that we read at some point. And he said something like, "A gentleman knows well enough, but everything a fool knows is bad for him." And it's like when you said the meaning, like they're searching for meaning and they found meaning in this, and it's like, I guess it's a messed up way of saying like you can find meaning in the wrong things. And I guess the way I best understand that quote is like a person who's sane, like what they know what the right path is in a sense, and sometimes they just kind of lie to themselves about it. But a person who's kind of like lost that sanity, everything they know is bad for them, and that's a
Mm,
weird kind of place. And it's like, how do you tell someone this thing that's so meaningful in your life is wrong? That's
yeah,
hard
yeah.
and messed up and like maybe pretentious. And is it right? And I guess it is if it's for their own safety. But man, I can tell you a quick
Mm-hmm.
story. Like a woman came into the hospital the other day and was like really, really old, and her husband. It was just like a lot, and like there was issues there, and she should have been sad, and she was like 90 years old, and it's like, don't send her to the emergency room. Like even if you think it's for safety, it's like there's something about like there's a dignity there that's like you're taking away, putting them in this kind of shitty environment that they don't understand why they're there. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
like I don't know, like when are therapists or healthcare workers or social workers or the government, like when are we overstepping? And like you know what I mean? I guess it's
Yeah.
a
Who brought her there?
so it was from a facility, which is even worse because it's like, what the heck is this person not going to do anything? Like I can't say too much about what it was, but it was like
Sure.
it was one of those situations where like they said something that was congruent with what was going on in their life, and it was misconstrued as like almost like SI.
Do you know how many elderly individuals say like statements about wanting to go to heaven
Of
or
course, and see
just
their
kind of
friends
being
and shit. You know what I mean?
right,
Like I
right, or
mean,
just being kind of done, just being done.
and it's like, yeah, dude, that's okay. Because if that was me, I'd be like, leave me I'm pushing 100.
I have this woman that I work with that's like 84, but she has autism and dementia, and every now and then she'll just come out and go, I can't wait for the good Lord to take me. And
Yeah.
like, and people ask me, is that should we document that? Is that I'm like, she says it every other day or something like
Mm.
that. It's not that serious, but by all means, please document it. However, she's not making an actual threat on her life.
No,
So
no.
yeah.
Like have a little common sense, I think. Right?
It feels like sometimes people in our profession can be nervous about
That's it.
what if I get it wrong, right?
Hmm.
And I get it. There's liability, and that is something that is always on our mind. But
But don't let getting it wrong get in the way of like getting it right. You
you
know what I mean?
could
Like
you
the
could
fear of
really
getting it
ruin
wrong.
someone's
You know what I
day,
mean?
week,
Yeah.
month,
Yeah. Like,
life.
is this good for them or is this good for me?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that, there's a
That's
difference.
schools do that a lot with
Yes,
their
they do.
blanket statements about, especially with SI or threat, or like
Mhm.
violent threats. It's a very strict policy, and for kids that have developmental disabilities or on the spectrum or just have other emotional regulation disorders, like that can be very challenging because a lot of times they don't have the language to express what they want to say. So they just
Yeah.
say these huge statements.
Hmm.
And then the school says, well, by policy, we have to send them to the hospital.
And
And
it's
it's
like,
like,
damn.
no, that's horrible because ultimately they left school. And maybe that's even reinforcing for all I
I know.
know,
I know.
but
No, it is. It's complicated, but there's something there. And maybe there's an issue with I don't know, there's so much to get into on like liability and stuff like that. Maybe
yeah,
that's something that's a podcast. Like,
liability is
or, you know what I mean? Like, what's
human.
our like, is it ever your fault that someone else hurts themselves? It's like difficult to answer
I
that
want to
question.
say there's probably this topic. Uh, what am I trying to say? Title.
Yeah.
It's probably like humanistic versus liability or something like that because
Yeah.
the liability doesn't always include humanistic approach, right?
Hmm.
A lot of times it has to be void of that because if you're thinking with emotion and you're trying to dig too far in, you could probably talk yourself out of making the decision that liability would tell you probably have to take.
Hmm.
And it's unfortunate at times, but sometimes it's necessary. So it's
I know.
such a tough thing. You know, it's interesting. We kind of got off on a tangent here, but I think the reason for that is you're right. Like there's an entertainment value to hoarding, which probably sounds terrible to say, but there's a reason there's a show that people watch about it. It's also very sad.
It is.
It kind of depresses me, to be honest with you. The whole idea of how somebody struggles so hard and can live in that deceit and isolate themselves away, and even just watching someone struggle with letting go. It's a really sad disorder. And I think that I was going to ask you, like, the stigma around it. Do you think there's a stigma?
Yeah. Of
Right.
course. Yeah. Yeah. Like, I mean, even there's even a guy in the city I live in who like got in trouble from the mayor because he had a bunch of stuff in his yard and there was like a whole like blowout about it and
Right.
all the neighbors were like calling
Neighbors,
on him.
when you live in the suburbs neighbors get pissed, and it's
Yeah, they
oh,
do.
it's such a it
But and
kind of
then at the
drives me
same time, if
nuts.
you're the neighbor and you've got like, milk crates and like things flying into your yard,
Sure,
um, maybe, I don't know. It's
I get it.
yeah.
But when someone's struggling with something, it feels like, is there another way we can approach this? But I know there's not always.
Yeah, I know it's a tough
So
thing.
there is a stigma, and I think that I wonder how much that stigma plays into identifying younger individuals with this disorder
I guess it would be hard to, yeah,
because they're all hiding
they're all hiding.
and they're probably not listening to this. I'm assuming, but just an
Not
assumption.
according to our demographics.
Right.
What are we like 40 to 80?
Yeah, like this little 18 to 25 and then 40 to 80.
Yeah.
Those are our sweet spots.
All right. Well,
Uh,
that'll wrap that up, I think.
so just some housekeeping
Yeah.
about the pod. We, as Greg mentioned, the mini episode comment he made, we have started to do an Apple subscription and a Patreon. So if you want to get access to little mini bonus episodes, we'll be trying to put those out at least monthly, maybe more if possible. We have one out currently that kind of coincided with the Heartbreak episode. So if anyone's interested, the rates for the subscriptions are super cheap and it helps support the podcast. But also, if you, I think it's the Patreon one, if you enter your mailing address, if we ever have anything cool, any merch or stickers or whatever, we'll mail you them. So just a little perk there. Also, though, somebody left. Oh, I want to say two things about listeners and their feedback. So got some really cool conversations going. I just want to give people a heads up. I think the next two episodes should be user listener recommendations. We had one that someone reached out to us about the other day, and it's been on our list forever. I think we should just get to it because it's actually something that he's going through or has been diagnosed with, and I think it's rather fascinating. So I just want, if he's listening, I definitely want to get to that ASAP. And then we have this other long-term listener who we've read his fan mail, Tyler, and he had recommended an episode topic, and I feel like that was a little while ago now. So I definitely want to get to that for him
Okay.
because he's been a listener for quite some time. But the other day, somebody left a comment saying, you guys need to make merch and they want to see shirts with that say Greg Slenderman. So I thought that was great. If you guys get the reference, that's kind of a throwback to numerous
Yep.
early episodes, I
The
believe,
first episode that we said that in was Urban Legends.
Urban Legends. And I
Yeah.
think that came up numerous times after because of your pronunciation of
Slenderman.
Slenderman. Slenderman. Yeah. But I wanted to see if anybody's willing to draw like a
Oh,
logo for Greg Slenderman. I would love that. And maybe that will be on the shirt.
yeah, Slenderman with a mustache. That'd be something.
That would be something. I need to see that. If someone doesn't do it, I'm gonna end up trying to take a stab at it myself. But yeah, send us either email utgnpodcast@gmail.com or hit us up on social media if you want to try and create a logo for Greg Slenderman.
That'd be great. We would
That'd be
love it.
great. So, all right, everybody. Thank you so much. If you haven't already, please leave a rating, subscribe, like, thumbs up, all that stuff, whatever platform you're using. We super appreciate it. But also, reviews are like the biggest thing that we can ask for. They help out so much and they're so greatly appreciated.
Yeah.
Even the ones that we don't really necessarily like to read, still appreciate that the person took the time to
And
critique
say
us,
whatever mean stuff you need to. Just
I
five
guess.
star it. I
As
mean,
long as you 5-star it.
yeah. Yeah, like
But
you could write this is the worst podcast ever, 5 stars. We will appreciate that.
we will. And it is nothing that we probably haven't heard in our personal lives. So
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
free. All right, everybody. Have a great night. We'll see you next week. Peace out.